In this video, we dive deep into the ongoing territorial disputes that expose the double standards of Western powers. From Taiwan's struggle with China to Ukraine's conflict with Russia, the Malvinas Falklands dispute between Argentina and the UK, and France's control over French Guiana, we uncover the hidden layers of geopolitical strategy and hypocrisy. Why are some independence movements celebrated while others are ignored or suppressed? How do international law and politics shift depending on Western interests? We break down the historical context, current events, and the underlying geopolitical interests that influence the world's response to these crises. Whether it's the fight for sovereignty in Taiwan or the overlooked colonial legacy in French Guiana, this video reveals the truth behind the headlines and exposes the inconsistencies in how territorial disputes are handled globally. Join us as we challenge mainstream narratives and provide a fresh perspective on these complex issues. Topics covered: Western hypocrisy in international politics, Taiwan's sovereignty, battle with China, Ukraine's conflict with Russia, the Malvinas Falklands dispute, Argentina versus the UK, French Guiana, colonial legacy and independence struggles. Geopolitical double standards. Watch now and explore the untold truths behind these critical territorial issues. Let's start. Geopolitical disputes and territorial claims have been central to global politics for centuries, and in today's world, many unresolved conflicts persist. Among them are Taiwan, Ukraine, the Falkland Islands, Malvinas, and French Guiana. These disputes, though separated by geography and history, all involve questions of sovereignty, colonialism, and national identity. In this article, we will explore the parallels between these regions, questioning the Western stance on sovereignty and territorial claims. The crux of the argument is that if Taiwan is not part of China and Ukraine is not part of Russia, then similarly, the Malvinas should not be considered part of the United Kingdom, and French Guiana should not be considered a French territory. By scrutinizing these international issues, we aim to address the apparent hypocrisy in how Western powers approach questions of territorial integrity and self-determination. Historical context of the territorial disputes. Taiwan and China. The history of Taiwan is closely intertwined with that of China, but their political destinies diverged following the Chinese Civil War. The island of Taiwan became the seat of the nationalist government, the Republic of China, after their defeat by the communist forces of Mao Zedong in 1949. Since then, Taiwan has functioned as a separate political entity, albeit one that has never formally declared independence. China, however, considers Taiwan an inalienable part of its territory, citing historical claims dating back to the Qing dynasty from 1683 to 1895, and the One China policy remains a cornerstone of Chinese foreign policy. Despite Taiwan's de facto independence, it is recognized as part of China by most nations, including the United Nations, due to China's political and economic influence. The situation has grown more complex in recent decades, as Taiwan has developed into a vibrant democracy with its own cultural and political identity. While many in Taiwan seek greater international recognition and independence, Beijing continues to assert its claim, threatening military action should Taiwan declare formal independence. The Western world, led by the United States, supports Taiwan's right to self-determination, though it officially recognizes the One China policy. This delicate balancing act highlights a double standard when it comes to territorial integrity, as Western powers often emphasize self-determination in regions that align with their geopolitical interests. Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine's struggle for independence and sovereignty from Russia has roots in a complex history that spans centuries. Under the Soviet Union, Ukraine was an important part of the Eastern Bloc, with Crimea being transferred from Russia to Ukraine in 1954 by Nikita Khrushchev, a decision that has fueled modern disputes. After the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, Ukraine declared its independence. However, Russia continued to see Ukraine within its sphere of influence. This tension escalated into conflict in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea following a controversial referendum, widely condemned by the international community as illegitimate. This annexation was part of a broader conflict in eastern Ukraine, where pro-Russian separatists supported by Moscow have been fighting Ukrainian forces. The West, especially the European Union and the United States, responded with sanctions against Russia and support for Ukraine's sovereignty. Western rhetoric around Ukraine focuses heavily on the right to self-determination and territorial integrity, both of which are denied by Russia's actions. The Malvinas, also known as the Falkland Islands, are a British overseas territory located in the South Atlantic. The sovereignty over the islands has been disputed by Argentina and the United Kingdom since the early 19th century. The Argentine government claims that the islands were unlawfully taken by British forces in 1833, while the UK maintains that the Falklanders have expressed a clear desire to remain British through referendums. In 1982, the dispute erupted into open conflict when Argentina invaded the islands, only for the British forces to reclaim them after a 10-week war. The outcome reaffirmed British control, but Argentina continues to claim sovereignty over the islands, arguing that they were part of its territory after gaining independence from Spain in 1816. While the UK insists on the self-determination of the Falkland Islanders, it dismisses Argentina's claims of territorial integrity. This position is viewed as hypocritical by many, particularly in light of the West's emphasis on territorial integrity in other regions, such as Ukraine. French Guiana, located on the northern coast of South America, is an overseas department of France. Unlike other colonies that gained independence, French Guiana has remained under French control, despite being geographically, culturally, and historically distinct from mainland France. The region's history is marked by colonization, first by the Spanish and then by the French, who established a permanent settlement in the 17th century. Today, French Guiana is an integral part of France, represented in the French Parliament and governed as a French department. However, the indigenous and Afro-descendant populations of French Guiana have long sought greater autonomy or even independence, arguing that the region's natural resources are exploited for the benefit of France rather than the local population. The French government's refusal to grant independence to French Guiana contrasts with its support for self-determination in other regions such as Kosovo or Ukraine. At the heart of these disputes lies a glaring inconsistency in the way Western powers, particularly the United States, the United Kingdom, and the European Union, approach issues of territorial integrity and self-determination. On one hand, the West champions the right to self-determination in cases that align with its strategic interests, such as Taiwan and Ukraine, while on the other hand, it dismisses or outright denies similar claims in regions like the Malvinas and French Guiana. In the cases of Taiwan and Ukraine, the West emphasizes the right of people to choose their political future and asserts that these regions should not be subjected to the territorial claims of larger, more powerful neighbors, China and Russia, respectively. The argument is that both Taiwan and Ukraine have distinct cultural identities, histories of self-governance, and strong desires for independence from authoritarian regimes. The West has invested significant diplomatic, economic, and military resources in supporting Ukraine against Russian aggression, framing it as a fight for freedom and democracy. Similarly, though less directly, the United States has strengthened its ties with Taiwan, providing military aid and diplomatic backing against Chinese pressures. In stark contrast, when it comes to the Malvinas and French Guiana, the West dismisses calls for territorial integrity and independence from the original or indigenous populations. The UK maintains that the Falklanders' right to self-determination justifies its continued sovereignty over the islands, ignoring Argentina's long-standing territorial claim. Similarly, France's grip on French Guiana reflects a colonial mindset that sees overseas territories as extensions of European power rather than recognizing the distinct identities and aspirations of the people who live there. calls for greater autonomy or independence in French Guiana are often met with economic incentives or military presence to quell any dissent. This double standard reveals a deep-seated hypocrisy in how the West applies international law and principles of self-determination. The question then arises: if Ukraine and Taiwan are not part of Russia and China, why are the Malvinas still considered British and French Guiana still considered French? The role of colonialism and geopolitical interests. Well, it's a complex and often contentious issue. Colonialism plays a significant role in the disparities between these territorial disputes. The West, particularly Europe, has a long history of colonization, which created vast empires that controlled territories across the globe. While many colonies gained independence in the 20th century, some territories, like the Malvinas and French Guiana, remain under European control. The Falkland Islands are a clear example of a colonial legacy that continues to affect modern geopolitics. While the British argue that the Falklanders have the right to self-determination, this argument overlooks the fact that the original inhabitants of the region were displaced by British settlers. Argentina's claim is rooted in the idea that the islands are geographically and historically part of South America, and that the current British sovereignty is a remnant of colonial occupation. The British position is further complicated by the islands' strategic location in the South Atlantic and their potential for natural resources, particularly oil. The geopolitical importance of the Falklands gives the UK a vested interest in maintaining control, regardless of Argentina's claims. Now let's talk about French Guiana, which is, despite being geographically located in South America, treated as an integral part of France, with full representation in the French Parliament. However, this administrative status masks the colonial dynamics at play. The region is home to diverse indigenous and Afro-descendant populations, many of whom feel disconnected from France and resent the exploitation of their land and resources. France's continued control over French Guiana is motivated by both economic and strategic interests. The region is rich in natural resources, including gold and bauxite, and is home to the Guyana Space Center, one of Europe's primary spaceports. These factors make French Guiana a valuable asset for France, much like the Falkland Islands are for the UK. The ongoing colonial presence in French Guiana and the Malvinas underscores the hypocrisy of Western powers who advocate for self-determination in regions like Taiwan and Ukraine, but refuse to relinquish control over territories that serve their geopolitical interests. The principle of self-determination, selective application. One of the most glaring inconsistencies in Western foreign policy is the selective application of the principle of self-determination. The United Nations Charter enshrines the right of all peoples to self-determination, yet this principle is applied unevenly depending on the geopolitical context. When it comes to Taiwan and Ukraine, the West frequently invokes the principle of self-determination. In the case of Taiwan, despite the One China policy being the official stance of many Western nations, the United States and its allies tacitly support Taiwan's right to govern itself. Taiwan has its own democratic system, a separate military, and a distinct cultural identity that has evolved separately from mainland China since 1949. Taiwan's de facto independence is regarded by the West as an example of a people's right to govern themselves, especially in the face of an authoritarian regime like the Chinese Communist Party. The US provides arms to Taiwan under the Taiwan Relations Act and frequently speaks in favor of Taiwan's democratic values and autonomy, even while officially adhering to the diplomatic fiction of One China. In Ukraine's case, the West portrays its struggle against Russian aggression as a battle for sovereignty and democracy. The annexation of Crimea by Russia in 2014, despite the pro-Russian referendum, is viewed as a violation of Ukraine's territorial integrity, leading to widespread condemnation and sanctions. Ukraine's right to choose its alliances, such as its aspirations to join NATO and the EU, is seen as sacrosanct by Western powers, who consider any attempt by Russia to impose its will on Ukraine as illegitimate. These positions align with the West's strategic interests, countering the influence of China and Russia, two major geopolitical adversaries. However, The emphasis on self-determination in these cases stands in stark contrast to the West's approach to other territorial disputes, particularly those that involve its own territories or former colonies. In contrast, the principle of self-determination is often sidelined or interpreted selectively when it comes to territories that are under Western control. In the case of the Malvinas, or Falkland Islands, the United Kingdom bases its continued sovereignty on the will of the island's inhabitants, who have repeatedly voted in favor of remaining British in referendums. This emphasis on self-determination, however, ignores the historical context of how the British first established control over the islands and displaced the original Argentine population. Argentina's claim to the Malvinas is based on its geographical proximity and the fact that the islands were part of the territory that it inherited after its independence from Spain. The UK's position is seen as hypocritical by many in Latin America, especially considering the West's strong stance on Ukraine's territorial integrity in the face of Russian aggression. In the view of critics, if the West respects the territorial integrity of Ukraine, it should also consider Argentina's historical claim to the Malvinas. Similarly, in French Guiana, the French government continues to exert control over a territory that is culturally and geographically distinct from mainland France. Despite being an overseas department with representation in the French Parliament, French Guiana is often regarded as a colony in all but name. The region's indigenous and Afro-descendant populations have long been vocal about their desire for greater autonomy or independence, but these demands are routinely ignored or suppressed by the French government. France's refusal to entertain the possibility of independence for French Guiana reflects a broader pattern of colonialism, where former European powers maintain control over territories that serve their economic and strategic interests. Just as the UK benefits from the resources and strategic position of the Malvinas, France continues to exploit French Guiana's rich natural resources and its strategic importance as the site of the European Space Agency's Guiana Space Center. The role of strategic interests in shaping Western foreign policy. At the heart of the West's inconsistent application of the principle of self-determination lies its strategic interests. Geopolitical, economic, and military considerations often take precedence over ideological commitments to self-determination or territorial integrity. This selective approach is most evident in the way Western powers handle disputes involving Taiwan, Ukraine, the Malvinas, and French Guiana. The West's strong support for Taiwan and Ukraine can be understood within the context of its broader rivalry with China and Russia. Taiwan represents a crucial ally in the Pacific, acting as a buffer against Chinese expansionism. The US has a significant interest in maintaining the status quo in Taiwan, as a formal declaration of independence could provoke a military conflict with China, destabilizing the entire region. Taiwan's strategic location near key shipping lanes and its role as a leading producer of semiconductors only heightens its importance to Western powers. Similarly, Ukraine represents a critical battleground in the West's effort to contain Russian influence in Europe. Ukraine's potential membership in NATO and the EU would solidify its alignment with the West, dealing a significant blow to Russia's influence in Eastern Europe. The annexation of Crimea and the ongoing conflict in the Donbas region are seen as part of Russia's attempt to reclaim its former Soviet-era sphere of influence, a move that the West is determined to resist. In both cases, the West's support for self-determination is driven not only by a commitment to democratic principles, but also by the desire to curb the influence of authoritarian regimes in strategically important regions. This pragmatic approach contrasts sharply with the West's handling of territorial disputes that do not directly involve its geopolitical adversaries. The Malvinas and French Guiana, while not as prominent in global headlines as Taiwan or Ukraine, hold significant strategic and economic value for the UK and France, respectively. The Malvinas are located in a key position in the South Atlantic, and their surrounding waters are believed to contain substantial oil and gas reserves. Control over the islands also allows the UK to project military power in the region. as evidenced by the establishment of a significant military presence on the islands after the Falklands War. For France, French Guiana represents a critical asset, both economically and strategically. The Guyana Space Center is Europe's primary spaceport, making French Guiana essential to the European Union's space program. Additionally, French Guiana's natural resources, including gold, bauxite, and timber, provide significant economic benefits to France. These factors make it unlikely that France would willingly grant independence to the region, despite the desires of some of its inhabitants. In both cases, the economic and strategic interests of the UK and France take precedence over the principle of self-determination. This selective application of international law underscores the hypocrisy in the West's approach to territorial disputes. While the UK and France champion self-determination when it serves their interests, they are quick to dismiss it when it threatens their control over valuable territories. International law and double standards in sovereignty claims. International law provides a framework for resolving territorial disputes, but its application is often influenced by the political interests of powerful nations. The United Nations Charter emphasizes the importance of self-determination and territorial integrity, but these principles are frequently interpreted in ways that align with the geopolitical goals of Western powers. Taiwan's exclusion from the United Nations, despite its de facto independence, reflects the influence of China on international diplomacy. Due to the One China policy, Taiwan has been prevented from gaining formal recognition as an independent state, despite its clear desire for self-determination. The UN's unwillingness to challenge China on this issue demonstrates the limitations of international law when it comes to powerful states asserting their territorial claims. In contrast, Ukraine's case has received widespread support from the UN, with multiple resolutions condemning Russia's annexation of Crimea and its actions in the Donbas. The international community has rallied behind Ukraine's right to territorial integrity, imposing sanctions on Russia and providing military aid to Ukrainian forces. This strong response reflects the West's interest in maintaining a rules-based international order, particularly when it involves countering Russian aggression. The situation in the Malvinas and French Guiana, however, reveals the double standards in the application of international law. The UN has called for negotiations between Argentina and the UK over the status of the Malvinas, but the British government has consistently refused to engage in meaningful dialogue, citing the will of the Falkland Islanders. Similarly, French Guiana's status as an overseas department is rarely questioned in international forums, despite the region's distinct cultural and historical identity. These examples highlight the selective enforcement of international law when it comes to territorial disputes. While the West is quick to condemn violations of territorial integrity in Ukraine, it is much less willing to apply the same standards to its own territories or those of its allies. Conclusion: the hypocrisy of Western foreign policy. The territorial disputes surrounding Taiwan, Ukraine, the Malvinas, and French Guiana reveal a troubling pattern of hypocrisy in Western foreign policy. While the West champions the principles of self-determination and territorial integrity in cases like Taiwan and Ukraine, it ignores or downplays these principles when it comes to its own territories or those of its allies. The West's selective application of international law and its emphasis on strategic interests over consistent principles undermine its credibility on the global stage. If Taiwan is not part of China and Ukraine is not part of Russia, then by the same logic, the Malvinas should not be part of the UK and French Guiana should not remain a French territory. For Western powers to maintain their moral authority, they must apply the principles of self-determination and territorial integrity consistently, regardless of whether the territories in question serve their economic or strategic interests. Until then, accusations of hypocrisy will continue to undermine the legitimacy of their positions in global territorial disputes.